Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome back to our Bible study series going through the book of Ruth. Today's video we're going to be in Ruth chapter 3, and guys, the story is about to get good. I mean, if you've been following along watching the videos in chapter 1 and chapter 2, you know that the story has already been good, but here in chapter 3 we're going to see a real turning point in the story. So Ruth chapter 3 is actually the shortest chapter in the book of Ruth out of the 4 chapters. There's only 18 verses, but this chapter holds the climax of the story. Again, that turning point where everything comes to a head and we're left wondering what is going to happen next. And so, brief refresher on chapter 2, we have 2 of our main characters, Ruth and Naomi, and they have been in dire need of 2 things: in need of family and in need of food. And in chapter 2, we begin to see that need for food being met, but we're still left with the question of family, of how are they going to perpetuate their family line. And so chapter 3 picks up right where we left off in asking that same question, and I'm so excited to dig into this chapter. Like we've done through this series, I'll be reading through the entire chapter without stopping, and then we'll go back through it a second time and unpack it a little bit more. And so if you have a Bible, go ahead and open it up and turn with me to Ruth chapter 3. Verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning." So she lay down at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley, and he put it on her. Then she went into the city, and when she came back to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." All right, so that was Ruth chapter 3, and it seems like a simple enough exchange, but there's actually a lot going on here, so let's unpack it. Again, like there was in chapter 2, there's only one subheading for this entire chapter, and it's Ruth and Boaz at the threshing floor. And so since we can't break it up by subheading, we're just gonna walk throughout the chapter. The first thing I wanna point out, got my notes again, is the idea of this plan being hatched. So the chapter really starts out with Naomi devising this plan of how she was gonna get Ruth to present this proposal to Boaz. And so the chapter opens with her saying, Naomi saying to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you?" And I want to make a note on that word rest. In the Hebrew, the meaning of that word would be referring to a home or having children. And so it's really getting at this idea of family, of perpetuating that family line. And so that question we were asking at the end of chapter 2 of how are we going to perpetuate this family line, this is the question that Naomi is bringing up right here in the start of chapter 3. She is saying, should I not seek for you this rest, this home where you can have a husband and have children and perpetuate perpetuate that family line. And then right after saying that, asking that question, she says, is not Boaz our relative? And so basically saying, this guy whose field you've been gleaning in, is he not our relative? And again, this would have been an alert to the original reader to know that Boaz was an eligible redeemer. The other thing I want to point out here is that all throughout the book of Ruth so far, in the first 2 chapters, we have seen Ruth seek out the counsel of Naomi. And Naomi is her mother-in-law from her husband who died, but Naomi is also more broadly an older, godly, wise woman. And so all throughout the chapter, Ruth is seeking out the advice of this older woman. And here in chapter 3, we see her submit herself entirely to that advice. And so Naomi reaches out and says, hey, should I not seek rest for you? And is not Boaz an eligible person to seek that rest through? And so she's asking these questions and then basically giving Ruth this plan, giving her these instructions to follow of what she should do. And at the end of this time of instruction, Ruth responds and says, all that you say, I will do. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about what this plan is here in a second, but it's important to know that this was a bold plan, yet Ruth is taking in everything that Naomi is saying, and she's not questioning it or saying, but I don't really know if that's gonna work. She submits herself entirely to the advice and the instruction of this older, godly woman in her life. And I just wanna make that note because I think it is so important for us to do the same in our lives. I think that it's so important as women to have older women who have been walking in their faith longer than we have, who are maybe seasons ahead of us in life, who we can learn from, who we can seek godly wisdom and advice and counsel from. So let's get into Naomi's instruction to Ruth. Basically, the first thing Naomi instructs Ruth to do, I'm just going to read it here from the text. She says, wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak. This is the exact same phrase that is used in 2 Samuel 20. After David has lost his son, he's in this time of mourning. And then after the appropriate period of mourning, this phrase is used saying that he washed himself, he anointed himself with oil and put on his clothes. And it was to signify this shift from moving out of this time of mourning and into what is next. And so there's this similar idea here with Ruth that Naomi is instructing her to wash herself, to anoint herself with oil, and to put on her cloak. And it's this idea that Ruth has been in this period of mourning along with Naomi. They have both lost their husbands and they've been in this time of mourning, and this was to signal a shift and a move from that period of mourning into essentially being a bachelorette. And we see that in the instruction to put on your cloak. Basically, Naomi is telling her, get dressed up, put on your oils, make sure you smell nice, put on your nice cloak, and present yourself as a bachelorette. So Ruth is moving from being this mourning widow to an eligible bachelorette who is going to go now and present herself to Boaz. So this is what Naomi is telling Ruth to do, and then she tells her, get all dressed up and now go down to the threshing floor. So let's set the scene a little bit and understand what the threshing floor is. So she was saying, see, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. That was what Naomi said to Ruth. Winnowing barley, what is that? So winnowing is to blow a current of air through grain so that it separates the grain from the chaff. So basically, winnowing barley, what that meant is that at the end of this harvest season where they have been bringing in all of this grain, they would take that to this threshing floor area. I'm reading from my notes, and it would usually be to the east of the city, and they would do it after sundown because that's when you would get those breezes that would come in, and then that west wind would come in and they would be able to throw it up in the air, and that wind would separate the grain from the chaff, or the wheat from the chaff. And the wheat was the good stuff, the good part of the harvest, and the chaff was the worthless part of what was brought in. It couldn't be used, and so it needed to be separated from the part that could. And so they would go up to this threshing floor and use the west wind to winnow the barley, to separate the good from the bad, the useful from the unuseful. And this would have been more of a secluded place, a little bit more isolated, again, after the sunset. And so that is sort of the scene of this threshing floor that Naomi is telling Ruth to go to. If you're familiar with the verse in Matthew 3:12, 12. I'm going to go ahead and read it. It is John the Baptist talking about Jesus and talking about him coming and what he is going to do. And it says, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor and gather his wheat into the barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So basically, Naomi tells Ruth to go in the middle of the night, and Ruth listens to all that she says, and we get into that part of the story now. So it says that Ruth went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law commanded her. And then after Boaz had gone to lie down, it says that Ruth came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. And so this idea of coming softly is really just painting this picture that she was being discreet. And so she uncovers the corner of his garment and she lays down by his feet, but then something in the middle of the night woke him up, and he says, "Who are you?" And she responds to him and says, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And so I want to unpack this first little exchange between Ruth and Boaz here in the middle of the night. She says, spread the corner of your garment. And so this would have held a double meaning because they were physically there under this cloak or under this garment that she has tucked herself at the edge of by his feet. And so she's saying, spread basically your blanket over me. But this had the double meaning of saying, spread your protection over me, spread your provision over me, essentially asking him to be her redeemer. And this was actually the same word that Boaz had prayed in his prayer over Ruth. So if you remember in chapter 2, Boaz says to Ruth, "May the Lord bless you, and may he repay you for all of this kindness that you have shown to Naomi. May he bless you, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And that same word of spreading the wings over is now what Ruth is asking Boaz to do. So basically that thing that Boaz had prayed for, like, God, take care of this girl in this way, Ruth is coming to him now and saying, hey, can you be the one that God uses to take care of me in this way? So I feel like, especially if you've read this story before, it's easy to read through this and just think, yeah, this is what happens, and think it's totally normal. But I think we need to pause and recognize just how crazy this would have been, how bold this would have been. Ruth is basically going to this guy in the middle of the night while he is sleeping, crawling into bed with him, even though nothing happens beyond that, and telling him, I want you to pursue me in marriage. I remember a series my high school pastor did back when I was in high school on, I think it was probably on dating, but he was going over this part of the story, and he used the phrase, slip him a Ruthie. So he was talking about this idea of, should girls initiate? Should we pursue it all? And the idea here of slipping him a Ruthie was basically to say, to present that opportunity in a bold way, but then to allow him to respond in pursuit. So Ruth very much so is putting herself out there. She is making that interest or that desire for him to pursue her known to him, but then as we'll see as we continue on through this story, she is then allowing space for him to respond in pursuit. And so now we are going to see exactly what that was, Boaz's response. And there's a lot to unpack here. The first thing I want to go into is what he says of, you have made this last kindness greater than the first. So he responds to her immediately and says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. And this is going to clue us in right here to a significant age difference potentially between Boaz and Ruth. Don't think I would want anybody who is trying to pursue me to call me their daughter, but I mean, I guess it worked for Boaz and Ruth, but it's really here to signify this age difference. And that makes his next sentence make sense, where he says, you have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you haven't gone after young men. And so he's saying here, look, you could have gone after the young guys, but you didn't. And he here is flattered that she didn't go after them, but she went after him. And he says, you have made this last kindness greater than the first. And that's referring to the first time that he praises her for her kindness in her loyalty to Naomi. And he's saying now you have made this kindness even greater than that one in not going after the young men. And then he responds to her and says, I will do all that you ask, because all of my townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. If you watched chapter 2, you know that we focused on that word worthy as it described Boaz, and now he is using that same word to describe Ruth. Some translations will say you are a noble woman, and it is the same word that is used in Proverbs 31, where it says a wife of noble character who can find. And so that is how Boaz is referring to Ruth and how he is describing her. And so he's basically saying, yes, Ruth, I will do this. Everything that you've asked, I will do. But there is another Redeemer closer than I. So we talked a lot about the customs and God's plan for providing for the poor last week through this concept of gleaning. And similar to that was this idea of redemption, that in the family clan, there were prescribed relationships where if a woman's husband died, that this person would come in and marry her so that she could have children and perpetuate the family line. And there was sort of a hierarchy or an order to who that person would be. And so Boaz was in the clan. He was a part of the clan of Elimelech, where he was eligible to be that redeemer for Ruth. But there was somebody who was closer in line than him. And so what's really significant about Boaz saying this is he is saying, look, yes, I want to do this, but there is somebody who is in line before me. And so Boaz here was committed to doing it God's way. He wanted to marry Ruth, but he knew that somebody else technically had the opportunity to do that ahead of him. And so he was going to do it God's way, in the same way that he was following God's design to allow gleaners in his field. And so this is a man committed to God's way, committed to following God's design. And I think this is really cool here because at this point in the story, we understand that there is some level of interest, that Boaz is flattered and happy that Ruth didn't go after the young men, but instead came to him, shows us that he wanted this relationship with her. He wanted to marry her. Yet Boaz understood that if Ruth was meant for him, that he was not going to have to manipulate in order to get her. And so he said, you know what, look, we're going to pause. We're going to do this the right way. We're going to go to this other man who has this basically place in line before me to be your kinsman redeemer. Boaz had this open hand where he was going to allow that situation to play out instead of trying to force his desire or his will onto the situation. I want to read a note or a quote actually from Tara that she gave to us when we went through Ruth in our Zoom Bible study. And I think it just shows us a little bit of the character of Boaz and some of the qualities we should look for in a pursuit. So here's her quote. I'm going to have her channel linked down below again, but she said, Boaz makes his intentions very clear, and then he follows up on what he said he wanted to do. He was not wishy-washy. He was persistent in his pursuit of her. And I just think that is so beautiful. The way that Boaz pursues Ruth, it is this relentless, unwavering, consistent pursuit. He is not wishy-washy. He doesn't say one thing and then not follow through. He clearly makes his intentions known to her, and then he follows up on those. And so from that, I want to go over a couple characteristics of love that we can see just from these early stages in this relationship between Ruth and Boaz, and specifically in the pursuit of that. And so the first thing is that there is a pursuit. Again, Boaz makes his intentions clear, and it's clear to everyone. Even Naomi at the end of the chapter says, just wait, Ruth, wait to see how the matter is going to turn out, because this man is not going to rest basically until he settles the matter. And so there is this clear pursuit of Ruth by Boaz. The second characteristic of love we see from Ruth and Boaz is patience. So again, Ruth presents this proposal to Boaz and he says, yes, I want to do this, but I have to go figure out this other situation first. And so there is patience in their love because they are waiting to do it the right way. One, on this matter of redemption of, is this other man going to redeem her or am I? And then also on the matter of physical intimacy. They were in a situation where they could have easily crossed lines that night. Again, they were in a scenario that was isolated, that was secluded on this threshing floor. It was night. There could have been things that happened there, but they didn't. They waited to do things the right way. The third thing is that it protects. The text says that Ruth lay there throughout the night until morning, and then she rose before anyone could see her. And then Boaz sends her home with 6 measures of barley to bring back to Naomi. And one, this is again him providing for her, but the other measure here is that both of these things, both her rising in the morning before anyone could see her and him sending her home with the barley, both of those things were also to protect her reputation, because again, nothing happened between the two of them, but they were also protecting her and him from anyone thinking that it had. Because part of why he sent her home with this barley is because now as she is walking home from the threshing floor in the early hours of the morning, if anyone from the town would have seen her and had the question in their mind, why is Ruth coming home from the threshing floor, they would see her with this barley barley and probably have the assumption that she was there gleaning and bringing home grain to Naomi. And so that was something that came about in one of the sermons I listened to, and I thought that was a cool little point there, that he was protecting her and sending her home with that, but he was also making his intentions very clear to Naomi, because he had already communicated to Ruth what his intentions were, and now he was, through this extra barley that he sent her home with, also communicating those intentions to Naomi. The other way we see him protecting her in this is through doing it God's way, through saying, yes, I want to redeem you, but I'm going to give this other guy who is closer in line the opportunity to do that first. He is not selfishly seeking after what he wants, but wanting to follow God's way, and wanted above all else her to be taken care of, whether or not that happened in the way that he wanted it to. And so we see that love has this pursuit, it is patient, it protects, and it is pure. Again, they didn't give in to temptation, even though they could have. It would have been a situation that was rife with temptation for sexual immorality, but both of them walked away morally unscathed. They chose to truly love one another in their actions rather than giving into the lust of the moment and gratifying those physical desires. And a reminder that the book of Ruth, that it's set in the time of the judges. We've talked about this in the video for chapter 1 and for chapter 2, but this was a time when there was no king, when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And so people were disregarding the law of God, doing what they wanted to do. And a note I wrote from one of the sermons I listened to on this chapter said that from this story of Ruth and Boaz and from their exchange here this night, we see that it is possible to live in a godless culture when it comes to sexuality and still choose to do sexuality God's way. But we have the 4 P's of love: pursuit, patience, protection, and purity. And on that last note of purity, I want to make a quick note, hopefully quick, I feel like this is getting long, that this is a redemption story. So we know that Ruth is a Moabite woman, and if we go back to Genesis 19, we see where the Moabites began. I mentioned in the chapter 1 video that the Moabites were descendants of Lot, and how that actually came about was through Lot's daughters. If you know that story, you know that it is a crazy story. Basically, Lot's daughters are needing to preserve their family line, which, does that sound familiar? And there's nobody there. They don't know how they are going to find husbands and perpetuate their family line. So basically, they get their father drunk and they sleep with him, and they both have sons through their father. And the first son of that oldest daughter, that is Moab. So he is the father of the Moabites. And there's a lot more going into that story as to why there weren't men around for them to marry. Go read it in Genesis 19. But I just wanted to make that note because that is the history of the Moabites. And now here we have another situation where we've got 2 women who are trying to preserve their family line. And instead of doing it the way that the daughters of Lot did it, this story here shows us that there is another way. And that was through purity and integrity. And God provided through that. They didn't have to resort to this evil, manipulative, twisted way of bringing about a family line. They were able to act in purity and integrity, and God provided through that. And so I thought that was a cool little redemption story, that Ruth came from this people who chose to try to make things happen their own way, this way, and Ruth here now, generations down the line, has the same opportunity and the same need to preserve a family line, but she does it another way. And that just goes to show that no matter what the circumstances are, no matter how dire they seem, that there is always a path of purity and integrity that we can choose. So in conclusion, the chapter ends with this line of Naomi saying to Ruth, "Wait, my daughter, to see how the matter is going to turn out. For the man will not rest, but he will settle the matter today." And this is actually the verse I want to study a little bit deeper, just because I think there's some cool concepts and important truths for us to unpack in this verse. So I'm going to go ahead and grab out my journal and we'll dig in. Okay, so I wrote that verse out again. It says, and this is Naomi talking to Ruth, it says, "She replied, 'Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And honestly, I just wrote this out because I feel like I wanted to journal through it. I think it's just such a sweet verse because Ruth has put herself out there. She's stepped out in faith in obedience to Naomi, and it's just this reassurance from this motherly figure saying, wait, my daughter, until you learn how it turns out. Sort of like you've done all you can do, and now we just have to see how it turns out. We have to wait. But it's also this assurance of Boaz's pursuit in saying, the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. And so I'm just going to make the note of saying Ruth had stepped out in faith, and now she had to wait. And I'm also going to put the note here to say that this was after she had showed up faithfully day after day to glean. So Ruth has been showing up consistently day after day, and then she makes this big step of faith, and now she has to wait. So I'm just going to make that note. And the reason I wanted to write those things out is to just make the point and kind of make it clear that Ruth had done everything that she could do. She had done everything she had been instructed to do, and that was within her control. And now she had to wait to see how the situation would play out, which was not in her control. So I'm going to make a note of that. So I put, Ruth had done everything she could do. Now it was out of her control, and she had to wait to see how it would turn out. And I'm just going to underline that phrase, out of her control. And then I'm going to make another note to say that Boaz, on the other hand, was now taking action to pursue by seeing if the other kinsman redeemer was going to want to pursue Ruth in marriage. So Boaz was taking action to pursue. But he also did not have control over how things were going to turn out. He did not have control over whether or not this other man was going to decide to marry Ruth. So I'm going to highlight or underline again, did not have control. So both characters have different roles to play. Ruth has stepped out in faith, and Boaz is now responding to pursue. But even in the roles that both of them are playing, both of them ultimately are not in control over how things are going to turn out. Instead, they have to wait to see what God is going to do. And this brings us back to the theme of God's providence, of God's sovereignty, that both of these characters had roles to play in the story that required their active participation, yet God is still ultimately in control over the outcome. So I'm going to make a note of that. Okay, so here's what I wrote. It got kind of messy because I got excited, but I put both characters had roles to play in the story that required their active participation, yet ultimately God was the one in control of the outcome. He was the one writing the story. So I'm going to highlight that because I think that's a big idea. I don't even necessarily have some little pretty statement to tie this all up, but I just think that this is such an encouraging truth. I think that one of the most comforting aspects of God's character to me is his sovereignty, that he is in control, that despite all of our efforts and not neglecting the responsibility we have to, like this says, actively participate, that he is ultimately in control, that he is the one writing our stories, and we can trust him with that. And so I'm just going to make that little note because I find that to be so encouraging. So I put, God is the one ultimately writing our stories, and we can trust him with them. And that is where these two characters both find themselves here at the end of chapter 3. They've both done all they can do, and they now have to wait, like this verse says, until you learn how the matter will turn out. They just have to wait to see what is going to happen, to see what God is going to do. That is all for Ruth chapter 3. Let me know down in the comments what you learned from this study or any verses that caught your attention. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, and if you're enjoying this study, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up, and then also hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and then leave a gold star down below if you have been following along with this study in real time so far. I want to see who you are. But thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you back here next week for Ruth chapter 4. Bye.